In this lesson, we will talk about how MoGraph effectors can deform the objects, and I think you will find this lesson to be very, very interesting. You notice here that I prepared some of the materials just to make things a little bit more interesting, so we don't look at that really dull gray default material, and let's create a simple plane so I can demonstrate the first principle. We'll load the plane effector, but you will notice that I didn't create a cloner or any other generator from this list, and that is because you can use these effectors as deformers. So if you make an effector a child of the polygon object, you can actually use it to deform that object. And you will see now that in action here under this deformer tab that I was deliberately skipping, we have an option for deformation, and under this foldable menu we have an option to turn off the deformation to affect the object, so the complete object. Let's in fact show that. So there are some things you will understand here. You see that by default this plane effector will affect the Y position by giving it a 100 centimeters value in positive direction. So this guy will move 100 centimeters in Y if I enable this object mode. Let me just turn on line shading. Maybe things will be a little bit more clearer. And here comes a tiny obstacle you have to understand. If I change this to, let's say, polygon mode, you will see slightly different results. In fact, you will see a huge result change. So if I change this to point mode, you will see that these guys actually moved, relatively speaking, on another axis. So while in point mode, you will have to adjust the axis accordingly, so because it really doesn't use the axis system of this object. So you can change that by this transform space. So for example, setting it to object, and it will do its thing properly. So now this guy will actually work. Or since I suggest you stay in this relative node, we'll simply change the value, and in this case this should be Z. So you really don't have to bang your head about which of these axes will work. Simply enough for you to know that one of them will move this guy where you want it. If you want different kind of control, then you will have to explore this transform mode and transform space a little bit more in detail. Now, apparently, you really cannot see any deformation going on simply because we told this guy to move it 100 centimeters, and we told all points. If you want to constrain the effect, you'll have to use a fall off. So let's use maybe a box fall off, and now things will become much more clearer. Now the effector is only deforming points inside the fall off zone, and it's actually deforming the object. So now this fall off guy will probably make more sense. You can see this is without a smooth transition, so it creates really abrupt plateau, and bit fall off, it's really soft and somewhat smooth. You will have to turn off this clamped guy to see some of the effects you will possibly load with the spline here. So let's maybe load a cosine spline, and you'll see if I turn off this clamped, you'll notice a slightly different results, and of course you can animate this. I hope that you understand this. Now there is a difference. I hope you can see it in the way that it animates. So if it is clamped, it will pretty much generally give you a more softer and uniform results, as opposed to this guy. When it's turned off, it can be somewhat a little bit of an unwanted motion, so it can really snap widely or stuff like that. So let's actually reset this. So this can be useful in many ways. Of course, you can enter a negative value here, and that's under fall of actually clamp. You will see the difference now. It will close this gap, so to speak, so you have a really nice results. And of course, spline mapping will work. So you can in real time deform your object, which is actually really great. You can scale this effector and create maybe interesting results. The great thing about this fall-off is that you can use polygon object or even a spline for your deformation. So let me just delete this guy. Actually, I have an idea, and it can be really useful. So let's create a landscape object. We will convert it, and this is really a common problem where you want to create, let's say, a canyon in your terrain or something like that. And I really want to show you a simple way to do that. The first thing is I will actually go to my top mode, and let's draw a simple spline. So let's say that this is maybe our river. I'll go to the front view, and since I want to project this guy, I'll pull it just a little bit upwards, go back to my top view, and use this new fancy project object option here under character commands menu, and I will hit this little guy, which will give me some options, and the default option is points to surface. So let's hit OK. Now this spline will be simply projected to this surface. Now let's create the same plane effector we had. So in this case, the repetition will help you get accustomed to using this effector. So we will use deformation in point mode. You will see things go a little bit crazy. And the reason for it is that this parameter is really telling those points to move in that direction. So let's actually put 0 here and use the correct axis. So let's go with a smaller value in this case. So let's say like something like 10, or maybe in the negative value, because we want to create the indentation, the riverbed. So pretty much the same thing. Under fall off, we will load maybe a box guy. So you can see it really deforms that surface. But instead of box, we will use this source. So now we will get a source link slot, and this is where I will drop my spline. So watch what happens after this. You can see that it really created the indentation according to that spline. Let's actually increase this maybe to 20. It will be a little bit more obvious, and maybe we could even use a material for that, so it's much more easier to see. Now, under this fall off guy, there is a sample detail, which really means how coarse or how correct the sampling will be. So generally put this to 100% because it is really not intensive in terms of processing power. So it can be at 100% all the time. And this guy here is simply the distance from which the points will be sampled and will affect the surface beneath. So if I increase that, the gap will be wider, and accordingly if I decrease that, the gap will be smaller. So you can really play with this value. Let's actually create a really deep canyon, something like this. So the benefit of this is that those deformations are really non-destructible. So if you select your spline, or let's say a spline point, these things still work, and that is absolutely great about MoGraph. Let's maybe put this to -50, so it's some sort of a reasonable value, or our polygons will become really elongated here. Now you could possibly think that you're limited only to a single effector, but in fact you can stack 1,000,000 of them under objects and they will all work combined. Same works for applying effectors to cloners, so a lot of power and flexibility there. Let me in fact show you. So For example, let's say that we copy this guy and instead of using our source link here, so we don't want to use a spline, we will use maybe let's say a sphere, and you will see that it will also deform this object. But go a step further. Let's actually scale this guy down, and I will show you how to create something really nice that can be used in when creating medical animations, such as maybe something going through the blood vessel or something like that. So now let's align this guy, this plane effector, to a spline, and we can align it to the same spline. So now we have a little bit more elaborate setup. So now this guy will deform according to the spline path, so it will add to existing deformation, and of course the setup is non-destructive. So if I move this guy, you will see that this fall off is following. So that is one concept you have to understand about MoGraph. Everything is pretty much parametric, so things tend to be non-destructible, and that is the real power and opens a lot of possibilities. Now let's get rid of all these guys. Maybe we will use something different for the next effector we will explain. So let's create a plane object. We'll also convert it, and we give it this nice soft pink material. I think it's really nice. So we'll now add a formula effector, which is really oriented for people that really good with mathematics and understand things with like sine wave, cosine wave and stuff like that. But actually it's not really that difficult to understand that. So here, instead of checkboxes that you have in other effectors, you will simply enter the mathematical formula, and Cina 4D has a appendix in the documentation where you can find all that functions explained, what each of them does. So here under help menu, under appendix for formula, you can see that we have a bunch of options. So it looks scary at first glance, but actually it's not that scary, as I will show you now. So let's first enable deformation for our guy, and you'll see that something will immediately happen once I switch to point mode. And I generally suggest that you use this point mode instead of polygon mode, because it will give you pretty much always better results. Let's here under parameter keep it simple as we can, and we will turn off the scale, and maybe I would rather want this guy to be in Z. So let's say 50 in Z, and now the deformation is much more easier to understand. So now this guy will deform this plane 50 centimeters in point mode, so it will deform the points according to this formula here. You have some variables here, so we will not go really in depth with this. So this guy, this formula effector, has a temporal component to it, so it really understands time. So if I press play, you will see a wave-like motion, and this can be a little bit difficult for people that are not really technically oriented. So for example, here we have degrees. Let's, instead of 360, enter maybe 45. So you can see the difference in the behavior. This is a project time, so if you lower this, things will be slower, and of course if you increase this, things will be faster. We can go with 10, so you can see the result real time. Let me stop this, go back, and here are some variables that are explained, and I really suggest, if you want to play with this formula effector, to really take a look at the appendix of a formula, so you can play with the values and get results that you need. So maybe just to clarify this formula a bit, is that this first guy, this sin, simply means a sine wave. This ID is the ID of the clone or the component, and of course the count. T stands for time, so I really don't want to bug you with all that technical stuff. So maybe if we enter here a cosine, so COS, and maybe with an addition of H, so it's hyperbolicus. I really hope I pronounced that correctly because I won't do it twice. And let's hit play and we will have a different result. So it's a really good idea to understand these mathematical functions and operators to use this guy effectively. So I hope that makes sense. And this formula effector in right hands can really produce spectacular results. So let's delete it, and I'll show you something that is much easier to understand and you will be really happy about it. So let me load a shader effector here. So although this guy is a complex and scary, when used in this constellation is basically really simple. So I will make it a child of the plane object, exactly the same as for every effector, and I will load a custom shader here. So let's load maybe gradient, and nothing will happen unless we enable the point deformation. So here under parameter, scaling the points really has no effect because the principle of scaling the points is really a logical contradiction. So let's disable scale, but position of the points is completely another story. So let's maybe drag this guy upwards or give it simply 100 centimeters value. And you can see that this guy now deformed the points according to this gradient here. And just to prove it, let's do something like this. You see how it really corresponds to this shader. So maybe inversion will give you another insight what is possible. This could also vividly explain this 2D V option, so it will happen in another direction. And I'm showing you all this because with this guy it's simply possible to deform any object with a shader, and that's very, very powerful. So let me demonstrate that with a couple of really great examples. And maybe a good idea would be to, let's clear this for now, so we get a basic state without deformation. And I think I will subdivide this plane a few times, maybe once, maybe just once more. So we have a rather dense geometry that could really show the effect of the shader we will load. And in case you didn't know by now, in Cina 4D, many shaders have a temporal component to them. So let's maybe load a, let's say, a cyclone shader. Okay, I think the screen is cut off a little bit down, but that's okay. And we'll change this Z value to something more acceptable. Let's say 10 centimeters. And if I hit play, watch the magic. You can really also enable guard shading mode, so we don't have those lines in the viewport. And how about this? This is really awesome. Imagine something like this on a character skin, or you can really have fun with this. So let me show you another one. So maybe we could have fun with, let's say, a fire shader too. Say something like this. So in this case, if this thing happens, so you have some sort of really unwanted results, really turn off tiling if there is such option. So you really have nice deformations on that plane. And this is the actual deformation. So the actual geometry is being deformed. That is really great. So let's go back. Maybe we could load another one just for fun because they're really fun to work with. So let's try this sunburst. I think you cannot see that because the video is cut off, but trust me, that is the sunburst shader. Let's hit play, and we could even go one more subdivision, okay, like this. And if you have these artifacts in the shader, you can really utilize this blurring, so things will be a little bit better. And This is the reason I was telling you that it is really essential to understand the material system. It is really important for you to understand many things inside Cine 4D before getting to know MoGraph and its amazing capabilities. So let's maybe load a noise shader, because those guys also have a temporal component, but it's a little bit hidden. So this animation speed, if I enter maybe 1 here, will now make sense. So any noise type or any of these guys of procedural shaders in Cine 4D that has this setting can be animated. So that is pretty much awesome. So also you can limit that behavior just to a certain area. So let's say to a sphere. So how about that? That is absolutely great. I really cannot begin to tell you how amazed I am by possibilities of MoGraph. It is simply fantastic. Now I want to show you a few more effectors, but I think it is much better idea for me to create a clone setup rather than trying to explain these guys on in this deforming mode, because I think that would be a little bit too complicated. So for example, if you play with this slice, you can have different results, but that guy has to be rotated. So let's give it a shot like this by 90 degrees and really slice off this value. Okay, so we pretty much have some sort of a Pac-Man here or stuff like that, but let's not waste time with it. I will create a simple clone setup. So let's create maybe a simple cube like this. We'll scale it down because it's simply too big for my taste. So something like this, 20%. I will alt click the cloner so it becomes the parent of this guy. Let's go with 10 and would rather go in the X direction. So let's maybe set 50 here like this, and just for fun we will give it maybe this, let's go with the blue color in this case. So let me show you another effector which is really easily understandable on this kind of setup. So I will load a step effector. So once loaded, we also enable this guard shading lines so you can actually see the volume of each cube. And here under step effector, which is very powerful, the scale is telling clones simply to increase themselves in size according to this spline. So let's maybe go rather with the position. So now, if I enter maybe 100 here, I'm saying this guy, and you can clearly see the spline shape here. So they will progressively, in step mode, increase their position. We can also enable scale, but I will use a lower value. So every single of these guys will become bigger with each step. I hope that makes sense. And all that will happen according to this spline. So if I play with this, you can see I'm changing the gradient guy. Okay, you can also go maybe with something like this. So now these guys here, let me just emphasize that these guys here, which are on the top position on this spline graph, will become bigger. Of course, we could maybe add a little bit more gap to these guys. So this step effector is incredibly powerful and can create really great results, and can really be used in architectural modeling. So you can simply create any type of stairs and stuff like that. In color mode, if you're interested in color mode, this guy will simply use a gradient to deform the clones. So let's actually get rid of this point. So we'll just select it and delete it. So now, and I will get rid of the material because you will be able to see that gradient. Now, since this guy is now going from completely black to completely white. So black is 0 of this value, 0%, and this guy here, white, is 100% of this value, so also works with mapping through this spline. That is really clear in this example. This step effector is really great. We will use it in later lessons also. Now let's get rid of this all, and we will take a look at another effector, and in this case let's explain this time effector. I would rather skip this coffee and Python effector because I think coding and usage of code in effectors is a little bit beyond of the scope of this lesson, and it's really appropriate for project training. So let's go with our time effector, and let's create maybe a torus. I will scale it down also, and I will put it under a cloner. So once again holding the Alt key and hitting the cloner, and I'll create just one clone for now because I want to show you what this effector does. And in fact it's very simple. So first thing you have to do, and not forget, or nothing will happen, the effector has to be loaded here in the effector tab. So now we'll take a look at some options here, and basically we have all the same options we have for other effectors, so fall off, deformer, and parameter. Now, since this is a time effector, it works with time. So if I hit play, it will actually spin this object by 90 degrees per second. So let's actually change this to maybe, let's go 90 here. So it will do 90 degrees in a second. Let me just show you that my project settings are 30 frames. So it will come to 90 degrees exactly at 30 frames. So it's dependent on the project setting frame rate. So that is really important. Don't forget that. And of course, if you enable position and tell it to move 5 centimeters in Y, in each second it will do so. Let's actually use maybe 50, so it will be more apparent. So that is really one great and very, very useful effector. Okay, let's put this back. And also, what is really great, you can draw a spline and tell this guy to move over a spline with this spline effector. So first, we have to change this to object mode. So now once I load a spline here, I will get a bunch of clones. I will actually drop this to just one, use the even distribution. So if I press play now, you will see that my object is spinning. But it's not really aligned to that spline, and that is a bit of a problem. So here you can see it's not conforming to that spline. It really struggles between the setting in time effector and the settings in the cloner. So what I want to do here now is I want to disable this object mode and use a special effector for such cases, and that is a spline effector. So now our object is freely floating and moving upwards. We can actually get rid of this rotation because it will make things much more clear. We'll stop this, go back, and although our cloner now is in the linear mode, we can still use a spline effector. So let me create it. And this spline effector is now loaded as a second guy in our effectors tab of the cloner. And this is really important. The order of these guys is important. So if the setup is not working as you expect and you are using multiple effectors, there is a really good chance that something is executed before something else, and you should correct that with the logical order of these guys. I hope this makes sense. So now here under my spline effector, which has a little bit different options. The fall off and deformer are the same. Parameters a little bit different, and we will maybe explain them a bit more in depth in later lessons. And here under Effector, we have options that are very similar to options you receive once you drop a spline into a cloner, and the reason for it is actually to give the ability to other MoGraph generators, among other useful explanations, to have the ability to create parametric systems on splines. So let's not overcomplicate it and drop our spline here. So now what will happen, our guy will listen to our spline effector and adjust itself to this spline. And now you have all these options present, so you can offset the clone on the spline. You can really define the starting and the end position, and I think this would be much more easier if I created a bunch of these guys, and maybe it's a good idea to scale them down so you can see things better. You can maybe clamp them so they will not appear once again. They are simply offsetting from the starting point. You can define the starting point, you can define the end point, and we will talk about these other settings in later lessons. So it also has a fall off, it has a deformer, and it has this parameter tab. Now, the reason I'm showing you this is simple. In my time effector, I will set this rotation, and let's leave it at this 90 degrees value. Now let's press play, and nothing will happen, even though this guy should tell these clones to rotate 90 degrees. The reason for it is here in the order of execution of these guys, because this spline effector also affects the rotation, so it simply is taking over. The last one is taking over. So effectively, let me stop this for a moment, it's a bit distracting. So effectively, he is the one responsible for the rotation. Now, if I simply change the order, so drop this time effector after the spline effector, you will see the clones will be rotating, and this is very important concept for you to understand. So make sure the order of execution is right. Of course, now you can blend some of the values. So let's, for example, you can play with this offset and the guys will still rotate it. So this time effector didn't took over the position value. So if I would enable this, it would simply take over the complete control. So be aware of that. Some of the things cannot be really blended seamlessly like this setup, but for this particular setup I would maybe use a cloner or even this spline rep. So it was really just a demonstration of how the order of execution of effectors is important. Now I will show you just two more effectors, and we can then proceed to our next lesson, but let's just briefly take a look at those two. So I'll get rid of this spline effector and time effector, and also this spline, and I'm left with these guys here, which are really gray and boring, so we will give them maybe this blue color, so they're a little bit more interesting. So maybe we'll also tune down this value so they are a little bit more closer together. I want to show you this target effector, which is really simple to understand. Simply tells the clones where to look at, relatively speaking. So you can pretty much move this guy and the clones will orient themselves according to where that effector is positioned. Also, you can use a target object instead of this effector, so this effector can stay, let's say, in the center of the scene, and you can use any other object as a target object so the clones will look at it. What is useful, there are several target modes here. So for example, you can enable this look at camera. So no matter how you rotate your scene, no matter what you do, those clones will look always at the camera. And sometimes this is very, very useful. You can go back to object target. This next node and previous node simply will align the clones according to previous and the next clone. I think that this deformer and fall off tab really don't need any more explanation. It's pretty clear that those things are common to all effectors. Now, interesting feature here is this repel guy. So if you enable it, you'll get the distance option. So now all these guys will simply try to stay away from that effector in this distance. So if you lower the distance, naturally the effect will occur later. So if it is really high, those guys will try to keep 100 centimeters distance of this effector. Of course, there is a strength value, so you can really tune down to whatever you like. Every single one of these little generic setups that I'm showing you has multiple practical applications. So let's maybe for this guy, imagine that you have a spaceship and a random asteroid field, and you really don't want to crash into the asteroid field. So you would use a bunch of rock objects for asteroids and would use this target effector as a child of your ship with a big enough radius, or you can utilize this fall off and simply load the shape. So the ship would simply avoid all asteroids by default. So I think that is clear enough. So every single of these small setups has a practical application. Now let me show you just one more effector. So I could even get rid of this completely, and let's get rid of this material, and I'll use a different objects just to have some sort of variety in these simple examples. And let's use a capsule object. Maybe lower the segment count, 5 and 5, so it's not too dense. Scale it, and we will drop it under the cloner. But in this particular setup, I will use maybe a radial mode, maybe space them a bit like this, let's say 10 guys, and could even copy this capsule because I want to create a variation in color. So let me add maybe a red one and a blue one here. So do we want a blue or a red pill that reminds me of a certain movie? So let's actually create a simple animation here. Let's say that we will animate the offset here. So these guys will really rotate. Let's give it a keyframe here with a control click on this guy. And let's go to frame 30 and maybe set this to, let's say 90 degrees. So give it a keyframe like this, and let's see what we have. And I used the different colors just to be able to show you things a little bit more clearly, and you will be able to identify the rotations a little bit better and the effect of the effector I'm about to load. So now with our cloner selected, I will add a delay effector. So now if I press play, you really won't be able to see anything unless this mode for this effector, which also has this parameter, deformer, fall off. The only difference is you cannot set values here. You can only affect position, scale and rotation, and you will actually not be able to see anything in this mode if you don't have a fall off, unless this is set to spring mode. So watch carefully. And I really hope you can see this. So let's hit play. Look how those guys really react naturally. Maybe I will increase this to, let's say, something like 75, and it will be more apparent. So there is really like a spring-like motion. Maybe just enable let's say a spherical fall-off and put it maybe here, so the effect will be more apparent on a single guy, so you will see the effect isolated. So let's hit play, and you can clearly see what is going on now. I think this is really great for adding secondary motion to your various clone animations. And there are also two more modes here, so let's just hit play and they will be self-explained in within that fall-off. So let's try with even. So you can see how it really somewhat of settles in, and it's really difficult to explain this effect. Maybe I will try this blend. So you see it really gradually slows down to that position, so that's really cool. Imagine keyframing all that. And this delay effector is really great, and we will use it throughout this training. So let me stop this, go back, and I'm pretty sure we covered most of the effectors. I think we only have inheritance and volume effector left, so we will cover them later. So in the next lesson we will talk about other MoGraph generating objects, and you will see that they are really powerful and that they are a lot of fun to work with. So let's leave our red and blue pills and continue to our next lesson.